The boutique store gleamed under the soft golden lights, shelves lined with designer clothing and rare collectibles. It was the kind of place where money wasn't a concern, only exclusivity mattered. The soft chime of the entrance bell rang as the door swung open. A woman stepped inside, dressed in expensive heels that clicked against the marble floor. She carried herself with the air of someone who expected the world to bow before her. Her eyes scanned the boutique, unimpressed. The store owner, a man with a calm and observant presence, greeted her warmly. "Welcome. Let me know if you need assistance." She barely acknowledged him, flicking through the clothing racks with disinterest. After a moment, she turned to him with a scoff. "Is this all you have? These styles are outdated." The owner remained composed. "We focus on timeless pieces. If you're looking for something specific, I'd be happy to help." She let out a dry laugh. "You? Help me? I doubt you even understand real fashion. A place like this shouldn't even exist in this district. How do you even afford the rent?" Other customers in the store turned their heads. A heavy silence followed. The owner, still unfazed, met her gaze. "I do my best to create a welcoming space for people who appreciate quality." She narrowed her eyes. "You mean people who can't afford real luxury? Let's be honest, places like this cater to wannabes. You probably don't even own this store, do you? Just another worker pretending to be important." A quiet tension filled the air. Some of the customers looked uncomfortable, while others whispered among themselves. The owner said nothing, his expression unreadable. "Why don't you just admit it?" she pressed, crossing her arms. "You're just some low-level employee, aren't you?" The man exhaled slowly, then gave her a small smile. "Enjoy your shopping," he said simply before turning away. She let out another laugh, shaking her head. "Unbelievable. You can't even defend yourself. That's the problem with people like you, no backbone." With that, she turned sharply and strutted out of the store, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. But as she reached the next high-end store down the street, she noticed something odd. A few shoppers who had witnessed the incident were staring at her, whispering. She ignored them. They were just jealous, probably. Then she felt something even stranger. The security guard from the new boutique stepped forward as she entered. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." She froze. "Excuse me? You're not welcome here." She blinked, shocked. "What? Do you know who I am?" The guard exchanged a glance with another staff member. "Yes," he said. "We do." Something was very, very wrong. The woman's face twisted in disbelief. "You're kidding, right?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "You can't just throw me out for no reason. I'm a paying customer." The security guard didn't budge. "We have the right to refuse service." She let out a sharp laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Right. So, what's the reason? Because I was just in another boutique down the street? Because I have good taste? Or is it because you don't know how to treat high-class customers?" The guard exchanged a quick glance with another employee. Something unspoken passed between them. Then he turned back to her. "I'm asking you nicely. Please leave." Her confidence wavered for a second, but she recovered quickly. "Fine," she snapped. "This place is beneath me anyway." She spun on her heel and stormed out, ignoring the curious looks from the other customers. As soon as she stepped outside, she checked her reflection in a nearby storefront. She still looked perfect, flawless, expensive, untouchable. She shook her head, scoffing under her breath. Ridiculous. She wouldn't let this nonsense ruin her day. Pulling out her phone, she called her driver. The phone rang once. Twice. Then straight to voicemail. She frowned. Strange. She tried again. Nothing. Her irritation deepened. She wasn't used to waiting. With an annoyed sigh, she decided to take a break and visit her favorite upscale cafe. As she entered, she was immediately greeted by the comforting aroma of roasted coffee and fresh pastries. A waitress approached with a polite smile. "Table for one?" The woman nodded and waved a dismissive hand. "Yes, obviously. The usual corner seat." The waitress's smile faltered. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that table is reserved." She frowned. "Reserved? I come here all the time. Just move whoever's sitting there." "I'm afraid we can't do that," the waitress said, looking uncomfortable. The woman's jaw tightened. "Fine. Just bring me a coffee." The waitress hesitated, then glanced at the manager behind the counter. The two exchanged a quiet, tense moment. Then the manager walked over. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," he said in a professional tone. "But I'm going to have to ask you to leave." She blinked. "What?" "I've been instructed not to serve you." The words felt like a slap. "Instructed by who?" she demanded. "This is absurd. I've spent thousands at this place. You can't just refuse to serve me." The manager's expression didn't change. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Her heart pounded. This was beyond bizarre. First the boutique. Now here. Something was happening. Something she didn't understand. She took a step back, shaking her head. "You'll regret this," she spat before storming out. She needed to regain control of her day. Whatever this is, it's just a coincidence. But as she walked down the street, she noticed the whispers. People glancing at her, murmuring under their breath. She turned sharply toward a group of women who quickly looked away. Her stomach twisted. Then, her phone buzzed. Relieved, she snatched it from her purse. It was a text from her assistant. "We have a problem. Call me ASAP." A sinking feeling settled in her chest. Her perfect world was beginning to crack. And she had no idea just how bad it was going to get. Her heels clicked rapidly against the pavement as she dialed her assistant's number. The ringing felt like an eternity. Finally, a hesitant voice answered. "Ma'am. I don't know how to say this, but—" "Spit it out," she snapped, gripping her phone tighter. "What's going on?" The assistant took a shaky breath. "Your accounts have been frozen." Her heart nearly stopped. "What?" "I just tried to process a payment, but the bank declined it. And then I checked, everything is locked. Your cards, your business accounts, even your personal funds. The system says there's a financial investigation underway." A sharp chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. "Who's behind this?" she hissed. "I don't know," the assistant admitted. "But, there's more. Some of your business partners are pulling out of their deals. They won't say why, but—" The call suddenly cut off. She looked at her phone. No signal. This wasn't a coincidence. Her eyes darted around the street, her mind racing. Just an hour ago, she had been at the top of the world. Untouchable. Powerful. Feared. Now, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Powerless. She needed answers. Without thinking, she rushed to her car. But as she reached for the door handle, the driver, her personal chauffeur, stepped out and blocked her path. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I can't take you anywhere." She froze. "Excuse me? I've been instructed not to drive you anymore." Her blood boiled. By who? He didn't answer. Instead, he gave her a polite nod and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the sidewalk, completely stunned. She turned, scanning the faces around her. People whispered as they passed by. Some gave her knowing smirks. Others looked at her with pity. She clenched her fists. This isn't real. This is a mistake. Desperate, she called one of her closest friends, a woman who had attended countless luxury events with her. Someone who owed her. The phone rang. And rang. Then. This number is no longer in service. Her breath caught in her throat. She dialed another number. And another. Every single one went straight to voicemail. It was like she had been erased. Panic clawed at her chest. Her last option, her home. She needed to regroup, figure out what was happening. She flagged down a taxi and climbed inside. The ride felt agonizingly long. When they finally arrived, she barely waited for the car to stop before she stepped out. But the moment she reached her front door, she froze. An envelope was taped to the entrance. Her hands trembled as she pulled it off and opened it. The words on the notice made her knees go weak. Your contract has been terminated. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. She read it again. And again. This wasn't happening. Her life wasn't just crumbling. It was being ripped away. And she still didn't know who was behind it. She stood frozen on the doorstep, staring at the eviction notice in her trembling hands. This had to be a joke. A mistake. It wasn't possible. Her home, her sanctuary, was being taken from her. Her hands tightened into fists. No. She wasn't going to let this happen. Shoving the paper into her bag, she stormed inside. Her heels clicked loudly on the marble floor as she marched toward the living room, grabbing her phone to call her lawyer. The call went straight to voicemail. Her jaw clenched. Coward. She dialed again. Voicemail. She threw the phone onto the couch, her frustration boiling over. What was happening? Her banking accounts were frozen. Her driver abandoned her. Her so-called friends vanished. And now her home was being stripped from her? Who had this much power? She needed answers. She grabbed her laptop and logged into her accounts, banking, business, legal. But every time, she was met with the same chilling message. Access denied. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just a financial issue. Someone wanted her ruined. Her breathing grew shallow. The walls of her luxury penthouse suddenly felt suffocating. She slammed the laptop shut and stood up. If no one was answering her calls, she'd force them to talk to her. Grabbing her coat, she rushed outside and hailed another taxi. Where to? The driver asked. She hesitated. She had nowhere to go. For the first time in years, she had no control. Her mind raced. Think. Think. Then it hit her. The store. The boutique where this nightmare began. Her stomach churned at the thought. Could it really be him? It was absurd. He was just a store owner. A nobody. And yet. She had insulted him. She had mocked him in front of others. Could he be more powerful than she thought? No. That was ridiculous. Wasn't it? Take me to, she started, but the driver suddenly pulled over. Ma'am, I just got a notification. Your ride request has been cancelled. She blinked. What? He gestured at his phone. I can't take you anymore. Your account's been blocked. Her stomach dropped. The driver sighed, giving her an apologetic look. Sorry, lady. You'll have to get out. Her hands clenched. You can't do this. But he could. And he did. She found herself standing on the sidewalk, utterly abandoned. The city around her moved as if nothing had happened. People laughed. Cars rushed by. The world didn't care about her downfall. For the first time, she felt small. A deep chill settled in her bones. There was only one place left to go. And if the store owner really was behind this, she was going to find out why. With no other options, she started walking. Each step felt heavier than the last. But she had no idea that what awaited her inside that boutique would change everything. The boutique looked the same as before, quiet, elegant, untouched by the chaos unraveling her life. But as she pushed open the door, something felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension. The moment she stepped inside, a hush fell over the store. Customers glanced at her, then quickly looked away. Employees whispered among themselves. She squared her shoulders, masking her unease. She was still who she was. Still powerful. Or at least, she had been. The owner stood behind the counter, calm as ever. He met her gaze with quiet amusement, as if he had been expecting her. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she marched toward him. "You," she spat. "I know you're behind this." He tilted his head. "Behind what?" "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "My bank accounts? My business partners? My eviction? All of it. It started the moment I walked out of here." He remained silent, watching her with an unreadable expression. A flicker of uncertainty crept into her chest. Was it really him? Could a simple store owner have that kind of influence? She pushed the thought aside. No. He had to be connected to someone powerful. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "I don't know how you did it. But I want you to undo it." His lips twitched, almost like he was amused. "Undo what, exactly?" She gritted her teeth. "Whatever stunt you pulled. Whatever strings you pulled." His gaze didn't waver. "You assume I have power over those things." Her stomach twisted. "I know you do." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he spoke. "Tell me something," he said. "When you walked in here the first time, how did you see me?" She blinked, caught off guard. "What?" He leaned forward slightly. "Did you see a store owner? A worker? A nobody?" She scoffed. "I saw a man pretending to be something more." He smiled faintly. "And now?" A cold shiver ran down her spine. She swallowed hard. "Now I see someone who can destroy lives." His eyes darkened, just for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't destroy lives. I expose them." Her breath caught. She didn't understand. He motioned toward the boutique's glass doors. "Look outside," he said. Confused, she turned. And then, she saw it. On the large digital billboard across the street. It was her. A video played in high resolution. Her sneering face. Her mocking words. Her insults, captured for the world to see. A live counter underneath displayed the number of views, millions and rising. Her blood ran cold. She turned back to him, shaking. You recorded me?" He shrugged. "I didn't need to. The world watches everything." Her mind reeled. No wonder her friends had abandoned her. No wonder her business partners cut ties. She had been exposed. Her own arrogance had sealed her fate. She felt her legs weaken, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For the first time in her life, she was afraid. And worst of all, there was no way to undo it. She staggered backward, her body numb with shock. The video continued playing on the massive screen outside, a cruel mirror reflecting her downfall. The comments flashing beneath it were ruthless. "Serves her right. Karma came knocking. This is what happens when you think you're better than everyone else. Her throat tightened. The world wasn't just watching. It was cheering for her destruction. She turned to the store owner, her breath uneven. Why? Her voice cracked. Why would you do this to me? He studied her, his face unreadable. I didn't do anything to you, he said. You did this to yourself. She shook her head violently. No. No, this isn't fair. You set me up. He exhaled, almost disappointed. Fair, he echoed. Do you think it was fair when you mocked people beneath you? When you humiliated workers just trying to do their jobs? Her lips parted, but no words came out. You believed wealth made you untouchable, he continued. That people like me were invisible. But you never stopped to consider, what if one of those invisible people wasn't as powerless as you thought? She gripped the counter for support. The weight of his words crushed her, suffocating her. This couldn't be happening. She was somebody. People feared her. Respected her. But now, they were laughing at her. She turned her gaze back to the screen, hoping, praying, for a way out of this nightmare. And then, she saw something worse. The headline scrolling across the bottom. Former socialite faces business collapse, more accusations of mistreatment surface. Her breath hitched. More accusations? She yanked out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the news. Post after post. Testimony after testimony. Employees. Drivers. Assistants. Even people she barely remembered. They were all coming forward. Stories of her cruelty. Her entitlement. Her complete disregard for those beneath her. It wasn't just about one moment in a boutique. It was a lifetime of arrogance finally catching up to her. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. No, she whispered, her voice barely there. This can't be real. The store owner remained silent, watching as the truth unraveled before her. Her entire world had been built on fear. On power. And now? Now, she had nothing. The weight of the moment crashed over her, suffocating. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to undo all of it. But there was no one left to silence. No one left to threaten. The world had turned its back on her. She looked around the boutique, her vision blurring. The customers who had once glanced at her with admiration now whispered with quiet satisfaction. She had been the queen. And now, she was nothing more than a fallen tyrant. Her knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to stand tall. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Taking a shaky breath, she turned back to the store owner. There has to be something I can do, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He studied her carefully, his gaze thoughtful. And then, finally, he spoke. Walk out that door, he said. Live a single day as the people you used to mock. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what you never did before. Her stomach twisted. He wanted her to live like them. Like the people she had looked down on her entire life. She swallowed hard, her pride warring with her desperation. But she had no choice. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. As she stepped onto the street, the cold air hit her like a slap. For the first time, she felt small. She had nowhere to go. No home. No friends. No money. Just herself. The very thought sent chills down her spine. The same streets where she once flaunted her wealth now felt unfamiliar, almost threatening. She walked aimlessly, ignoring the stares and whispers. Her expensive heels suddenly felt ridiculous, her designer coat useless against the creeping fear settling in her chest. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, hunger gnawed at her stomach. She reached into her bag for her wallet, then froze. She had no working credit cards. No cash. Nothing. For the first time in her life, she knew what it felt like to have nothing. The realization hit her like a freight train. This was what it felt like to struggle. To be powerless. To be invisible. She lowered her head, wrapping her arms around herself as she walked toward an uncertain future. And for the first time, she understood. The night air was colder than she had ever noticed before. Or maybe, for the first time, she had no warmth to return to. She walked through the city streets, every step heavier than the last. The towering buildings, once a backdrop to her success, now felt distant and unfamiliar. She clutched her coat tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't help. The cold wasn't just outside, it was inside her now. People walked past her, laughing, talking, carrying bags of food and shopping. No one looked at her. No one cared. She was invisible. Her stomach twisted with hunger. She had gone her whole life never thinking about food, never worrying about where her next meal would come from. Now, it was all she could think about. She glanced around, looking for somewhere, anywhere, she could sit, could rest, could think. Then she saw her. A young woman, wearing a worn-out coat, sitting on a bench with a small bag of food beside her. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, swallowing her pride, she approached. The woman looked up at her, eyes filled with quiet suspicion. She opened her mouth, then stopped. She had never asked for help before. Not once in her life. The words tasted foreign as she forced them out. "Can you spare some food?" she whispered. The woman studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand how someone like her had ended up here. Then, without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich, holding it out. She stared at it. This was it. The moment where she truly fell. Where she accepted that she wasn't who she used to be. Her hand trembled as she took it. "Thank you," she murmured. The woman only nodded, as if this act of kindness meant nothing to her, but everything to the one receiving it. She sat down on the bench, unwrapping the sandwich slowly. As she took a bite, a lump formed in her throat. It wasn't just food. It was humility. It was understanding. And for the first time in her life, she realized something she had never seen before. The people she had looked down on. They weren't weak. They were stronger than she had ever been. They survived. They endured. And now, she would have to do the same. She closed her eyes, swallowing both the food and the truth she had long ignored. And in that moment, she knew, this was only the beginning. Days turned into weeks. She had lost everything, her wealth, her home, her so-called friends. At first, she had fought against it, clinging to whatever scraps of pride she had left. But reality had a way of stripping away illusions. Now, she was just another face in the crowd. She worked small jobs, things she had once mocked, cleaning tables, sweeping floors, taking orders. The same kind of work she had once considered beneath her. She had no choice. And yet, something changed. She started to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The kindness of a stranger offering a warm meal. The quiet resilience of people who worked hard, not for luxury, but simply to survive. She saw dignity in struggle. Strength in humility. And for the first time in her life, she felt human. One evening, after a long shift at a small diner, she stepped outside into the cool night air. She was tired, but it was a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from honest work. Then, she saw him. The store owner. He stood a few feet away, watching her with the same quiet expression he had the day she first walked into his boutique. For a moment, she considered walking away. But something inside her refused. Instead, she approached him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He studied her for a long moment before finally breaking the silence. "You understand now, don't you?" he said. She nodded. She had once believed money was power. That status made her untouchable. But real power? Real power was in respect. In compassion. And she had never truly had either. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice quieter than before. "I don't expect anything, really. But I wanted to say. I'm sorry." The words felt foreign. But for the first time, they were real. The store owner studied her, then slowly nodded. "Good." She exhaled, something deep inside her shifting. Not relief. Not closure. But acceptance. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her one last time. "Remember this lesson," he said. "Because the world only gives second chances to those who earn them." She didn't look back. She didn't need to. For the first time in her life, she was ready to move forward. Not as the woman she used to be, but as someone better.